Hello, welcome everybody. I'm Kendra Mosley with Children in the Fields campaign, and I'm here today with Norma Flores López from Justice for Migrant Women. Her name is not coming up. Let me just shift the view a little bit so that you can see her whole, there we go. You can see her whole name and organization. So we are here today to talk about farmworker children as we do most weeks. But today the focus of our conversation is about school. It is September 10th, and everyone is in the thick of that whole transition right now. I know I'm also in it. And so it's on everyone's minds, and we just wanted to talk about the particular issues that farm worker children have that they're up against, because as in many cases, they have a lot more to deal with than the typical child that may not be working in the fields or does not have parents working in the fields. But first, I wanted to give a big shout out to our winners from 2020 for the art and essay contest. If you all watched the broadcast last week on Monday, August 31st, you saw their beautiful entries and their really heart-wrenching, very moving essays. I just want to name them all again. Our first place winners were Alexa Gonzalez Leaños, Karina Munoz, Alani Figueroa, and then our second place winners were Dalianis, Kelly, and Aaron. And our third place winners were Romina, Camila, Martin, and Jesse. So congratulations again. We were so happy to get all of those entries, and they were so amazing. And Norma was one of our judges, so she got to see the artwork and essays as well. And also, we want to give a big thank you to the Humberto Romano and Corinda Romano Foundation. They are our biggest sponsor for this year's art and essay contest, and we are very grateful for their support. So thank you so much to the Romano Foundation. And I wanted to say that Robin Romano is our late friend and a photographer of a lot of farm worker children, and we still share a lot of his work. So you may see his name on our page a lot, as maybe where you hear his name. Okay, so Norma, let's get started with our topic for today, farm worker children going back to school. You were one of those farm worker children, so you know exactly what they're going through right now, although there is now a whole new set of issues with COVID-19. I want to hear your thoughts first of all, just before I start on my list of issues.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure to be able to come on and talk about an issue that's very dear to my heart. As you mentioned, I grew up as a migrant farm worker kid myself. That's something that my parents did and their parents did. And so for many generations, my family has, gone out and done a number of different crops across the country. And so I always appreciate this opportunity to be able to share my experiences and this work that I've been doing with great friends. Having worked at AFOP, I had the pleasure of knowing Robin Romano and working closely with him and miss him dearly. He was very passionate, but I think that what we love the most about his work is that it was able to show authentically, these children, what it is that they were experiencing and helping us elevate these issues that are very important, including, the impact that child labor here in America has on children who are working, who on their education, on their health, on their well-being, and on their childhood. And so I think one of the biggest challenges right now, what's really hard for us to be able to see is, all of America is realizing just how hard COVID has been on all of us, especially as we're getting ready to go back to school. It has a different meaning, a different feeling to it, and its own different set of challenges. And for us that have been advocating for farm worker children, we acknowledge that, our families have that set, plus all the other challenges that they have had over in the past years. When I grew up working in the fields, we had issues like language barriers, the fact that my parents did not speak any English, the fact that English wasn't spoken in my home and I had to learn that. We had issues like having to migrate and having to have interrupted school years. And that, of course, set back family members and friends and colleagues of mine, and made it definitely challenging for me to be able to keep up with my schoolwork when I was starting late and having to leave early and trying to be able to complete assignments in between. It also was very difficult to be able to balance schoolwork with also needing to go help out my families during spring breaks. You know, most of the time I worked in the summers, but there were times when I had to work in the weekends or had to any opening. And I know that there's other children back then and now that will work after school or before even going to class and staying out late and not really leaving a lot of time for homework assignment. And all of this, you have to do it in places that have become, in places where rural in rural communities where internet access might be very difficult and reliable broadband. Um, as our studies have become much more reliant on technology, especially in this age of COVID, those are things that definitely worry us. Um, uh, Challenges that I didn't have to experience. This idea of needing to be able to do distance learning, of my parents having to come and help me. Those were things that I didn't have to grapple with that I know would have been impossible for my parents to be able to help me out with. Growing up having a computer at home was just unheard of and a luxury that was very expensive. Um, and so there's a lot of challenges that have been there generation after generation that has contributed to large amounts of children that are dropping out of school and not completing their studies and being trapped in these generational cycles of poverty. And then there's new challenges like the social distancing, like having to decide whether to send your kid for in person or not, having to prepare them in their workstations and having reliable internet. All of those are a new set of challenges that are very stressful for the families. Um, and all of it, who the person that ends up picking up that tab ends up being the children.
Exactly. Yeah. So let's talk about some of the new challenges that you mentioned briefly. First of all, just the technical side of things, the internet, the computers, the number of devices. Um, let's suss that out a little bit. Like, our farm worker children normally, um, like you said, you wouldn't have a computer in your house, or that was hard to imagine. Do you think nowadays there might be a computer in the house, at least one, or would that also be a challenge?
As we've been speaking with parents, I think part of the challenge is even if families do have, for example, a computer, you might have multiple children that are needing to access that computer. I feel like when COVID came through, schools were scrambling on being able to adapt and to be able to help close out the year. And now that they've had months of planning, we've heard of programs where the schools have been handing out devices for children, but those are, of course, in areas that have school districts that might have the funds for that, or areas where you might be able to have more accessibility and it's more urban. In rural communities, it continues to be a challenge to be able to have internet connectivity, but then also to be able to access things like going to the schools and pick up devices that are needed, and even if the schools have those devices available for people. So that's been a real challenge for people in making sure, because you are required to be in front of the computer X amount of hours. And I think that in itself is a challenge for us, that having to do these back-to-back calls and having to sit in front of the computer, it has been really hard on our eyes, all this blue light, and to ask a child, especially young children that learn by having hands-on experiences, I think are very hard for families. I know that with me working from home, sometimes I'll have tech issues, and I wish I could just poke my head around the corner and ask, the tech guy to come in and help me figure this out. And we know that that's not something that's available to our farm worker families. Parents who may not be so familiar with our technology and how to be able to fix a computer, or having to be able to grapple with that too, with old technology and trying to make it work and connect and update software updates and things like that. And so I know that those have definitely been challenges. So part of the work as Migrant Women has been, we've been ringing the bell from early on of saying, what community should be focusing on is making sure that farm worker children have access to the meals that usually they depend on at school, homework assignments that are more adaptable to them, that they could be able to do, whether it's helping them be able to establish a home learning environment with technology, and where they don't have computers, making assignments available through phone, providing alternative methods for these kids to submit their homework assignments, like prepaid postage envelopes that they could be able to mail in if it is that they can't go drop it off in person. Those are big demands that people don't think about, for these children, of having their parents having to go and drop off assignments and picking them up, especially during the school day. Farm workers, when the season begins, it's really hard for them to pull time away, especially in the middle of the day, to be able to get in a vehicle and go out and pick up the assignments and drop them off and do that shuttling back and forth. Um, and that's for those that are in school. Then of course there are parents that have children that are supposed to be in Head Start centers or in daycares, that many of them have restrictions. Some of them are still closed. And then comes the question of what do we do with these kids?
Yeah, it sounds like there's going to have to be a lot of flexibility on the part of the teachers, a lot of understanding. We are hopeful that the teachers that the farm worker children have are sensitive to their particular needs and situation. Um, so, hey, Claire, just give me a second.
I think you're absolutely right in that, and that's been part of the challenge before. Growing up, it was, always welcomed and a breath of fresh air to be able to find a teacher that was willing to be able to pause and try to help me and meet me at the level that I was at, understanding that I could learn, but it was just maybe I was at a different school district in a different state that was teaching me in a different way, or I just need a little bit of extra time to be able to catch up. And I still remember, the teacher that made the biggest impression on me was in third grade, because she was the first teacher that talked to me and didn't treat me like I was an idiot, because she actually saw that I was a good writer, that I was good at math, and treated me as such. And so it was really welcoming to be able to see a teacher who was willing to work with me. And so those, again, continue to be some of those challenges that farm worker children have in general, to have, teachers are already maxed out. They have a lot of their classrooms. They're having to be able to have children that are coming at different levels and have a lot of demands on them. But it's very easy for these kids who need a little bit of extra help to get lost in those systems. And so that's what we're definitely worried about, especially those that have special learning programs that they need and support, especially English language, English as a second language learners that need that extra tutoring and support. We need to be able to find ways to be able to extend that support, to be able to make sure that we're meeting them where they're at, to be able to bring them to where they're at. And at this moment, we're just concerned that there might not be resources, there might not be enough bandwidth for teachers that are also trying to be able to deal with all the other extra challenges you're referring to about technology and connecting and virtual assignments and things like that. So where we know that there definitely needs to be more support for these kids out there. We just don't know that teachers necessarily have the bandwidth, and it's up to the school districts to be able to find new ways then to support these teachers.
Yeah, and I'd like to put in a plug for migrant education. It's not everywhere, but the places where it is, it makes a huge impact on the lives of the children. So, and I know you worked with East Coast Migrant Head Start for a long time, so you know exactly how valuable migrant education is. Apologies
Absolutely.
for all the interruptions.
No, I mean, and that's part of the new normal, as we keep talking about, as parents are trying to be able to deal with the in-home instruction and trying to be able to balance because we still have to work. We still have to be able to have these conversations. We definitely understand, from our own personal level, we can relate to that. But as we were mentioning with farm worker parents, it's even a harder issue, because they may not have had the same education, can't help you with the tutoring with math, can't help you with trying to log on and get those assignments and finding alternative ways. And so we know we've been speaking with mothers who have been very stressed about it and wish that they could be able to do more to help kids in their education. They're very stressed about it because of the language barriers that they have themselves. And all of this additional stress of having to care for the children all the time at home, or by balancing the finances and trying to work. All of that has increased a huge need for mental health and support as well. Not just for the parents, as I mentioned, parents are stressed out, but even for the children too. The fact that they haven't been at school socializing,
I don't know.
playing with other kids, because a lot of these kids learn by play. As you mentioned,
Right.
I have a history of working at a Head Start program, and I know that that's one of the best ways for young children to be able to learn is by play. And right now, you have to balance that fear and wanting to keep your child safe, but at the same time knowing of what their needs are, of that interaction, of that attention. And so it's definitely very stressful for families, across America, for children across America. But as we keep mentioning, farm worker families, their children are under extra duress because they have less resources, less support. The majority of them live in rural communities, and so they don't have a lot of resources at their fingertips. And so we are going to have to put a lot of resources, attention, make sure that these families are not being forgotten, because we're going to end up paying the price. This, we're, if we keep a short-term view on this, and trying to just address the most immediate needs, it's going to be something that's going to come back and bite us, because long term these kids are going to be more behind than everybody else. They're going to be dropping out at higher rates, and it's going to take a lot more resources to catch them up, and to be able to help them out. And so I think that we are still at a time where we can be able to provide those resources for those kids, and be able to help and support them, and not forget them, as we're designing the rest of the school year.
Yeah, and what is the statistic for the dropout rate for children who work in agriculture? Is it 50%? I'm
higher than it's actually higher. 4 times the national average. And so when you talk to folks that work, you'll hear some of them say that as many as 2/3 of these children are dropping out. And it's really hard to be able to measure that, especially those that are married, because once they leave your school district, it's hard to be able to track them. These are, again, families that are living in rural communities, families that migrate often, families that sometimes have to leave their kids, pull them out of school to help them work in the fields. And so they get lost in the system. My parents were some of those kids. They were both, working in the fields at very young ages and not going to school where they belong. And so unfortunately for them, they always wanted to go back to school, and always felt that they could go back to school and catch up. And there were some of those that weren't able to. And that's a story that you hear over and over again across America, in the fields from farm workers. When you talk to them, you'll hear a lot of them that talk about how they weren't able to go back. That was always their dream, to go finish school. And so that's why my parents were determined to make sure that wasn't the case for me and my sisters. And it took a lot of sacrifice, a lot of hard work, a lot of adjustments to be able to make sure that we were able to be supported. And in addition to that, wonderful programs like Migrant Head Start, Migrant Education, the camp programs that exist out there, that it made sure that people like me were able to get an education and break that cycle.
And we know exactly how motivated so many farm worker children are, because we get their stories, and they talk. Hey, AJ, I can't help you right now. I can't. I'm sorry. Okay, at 1:00, not yet. Remember? Yes. My kids are in online school right now.
So you're living the truth that we're talking about.
And I just can't even imagine having the language barrier on top of all of that, and just even feeling like a fish out of water with the assignments that they're getting. Like my kids are in 2nd grade and in kindergarten, so their assignments are easy, but I already have some challenges, and I just can't imagine what it's like for someone with a language barrier as well. My thought just kind of fell out of my brain, but I did, okay, excuse me. I did want to bring up childcare, which I wish I had right now. So what are the options for farm worker parents when it comes to childcare, and this kind of, in a pandemic, when you can't send your kids to school and you can't send your kids to daycare, what can they do?
That has definitely been a huge challenge for families. For farm worker families, when the pandemic first came around, which was, as we know, mid-March, school was still in session. Many of the parents just had to, one of them had to stay home with the kids. There wasn't enough time to be able to arrange childcare. Many of the centers, like the Migrant Head Start centers, or even the summer migrant ed programs that they would have counted on in the past, shut down and didn't provide a child care alternative. What we see that happens when there's no licensed childcare, to begin with, as I had mentioned, in rural communities, it's really hard to find licensed childcare, and especially programs that provide it for free. Migrant Head Start programs are a great resource, but they're not always available in every community. And in those situations, farm workers try really hard to find licensed childcare. But many times, as we all know, childcare can be very expensive, especially licensed and high quality childcare. So many of these families, it's just unattainable, because they'd be going to work just to pay for that and not be able to have enough money to be able to put food on their table. Farm workers already live in desperate poverty, way below the poverty rates that we see across America. And so it's
It's
really hard
on. It's on.
for them to be able to make ends meet and
I need it on.
also for childcare. So what you see them is relying a lot on unlicensed, on folks that can just watch your children. And so when they're going through that, they're missing out on the work opportunities that provide by Head Start program or by the migrant education programs. So there's already, those opportunities for them to catch up or to be able to do well in their education and feel supported. They
Play
fall
downstairs.
behind even more so. And so with many of these families, like I said, what they ended up doing is one of the parents would stay home. Schools were closed. There were no childcare opportunities. They would just stay at home. And so what ended up happening is many of the mothers would stay at home and have both the burden of having to care for the children, feed them, do all the house stuff, and having to also be the teacher and having to do all of this on a turn of just very quickly having to take care of this. And so it was very challenging for these families, especially because then that also meant that half of their income was gone. And so with half of the income gone, families were really struggling to be able to make ends meet even more so. We're having to eat up the little bit of savings. We're having to pinch pennies, and depending on programs that were set up that could be able to provide some sort of COVID relief for them. Now, as the school year has started, some of those parents are still struggling with this notion of having to go back to work and expose themselves because they know in their workplaces not everybody has mandates to be able to do social distancing, and they know that they're putting themselves, their own health at risk, but then also their families at risk and their children. But they also know that they can't afford to not go to work. That timeline is very quickly approaching. Many of them are already there, and they're already eating. Like I said, they've already eaten all their savings. They're already eaten up the money that they had. The COVID relief money has been drying up, and so they know that they have no choice but to go back into the workforce. Um, and and then they're stuck with this of, do I leave my kid by themselves or do I take them with us? There are families that have talked about having to take their kids with them because they feel, at least here in the fields, I can see them and they're safer. I know where they're at instead of at home where I don't know what could happen. But what
Right.
many times these families don't end up seeing is the statistics that we see, which is the pesticide exposure and the long-term health consequences that has, the heavy machinery that's around them, and what that means, for many of these kids that end up getting hurt in accidents and having permanent injuries or even death at times. They don't see what it could mean for a young child to be out there in extreme heat or in extreme cold. They don't see these longer term effects that, bringing their children with them and how it impacts them and their studies, like we have seen, and the dropout rates and all of these other longer term effects that it has on their children. But at the same time, we know that these parents are having to make very difficult choices to survive. And so that's why it's important that we make sure that we're putting in the resources once again, that it's important that programs that provide childcare are able to open up safely and be able to put in those safeguards and have the resources to put in those safety guards to be able to mitigate the risk of COVID. It's important for farmer workers to be able to feel safe in their workplace, and that states and federal governments are putting in mandates that require farmers to be able to provide safe places so that they're not exposing themselves and their families into with COVID. And more importantly, it's important that we also make sure that the laws that are in the books are being enforced, that we don't allow for children to go work in agriculture at young ages, that they're supposed to be in the classroom, and that those current mandates are not only enforced, but that they're strengthened to make sure that young children are not allowed to forego their education to go work in the fields.
Reed Mackey's asking what the so you're talking about the laws. What remedies are there or can there be for child labor on American farms?
So at the moment, there are two sets of labor laws. There's those that are for agriculture, and then there's everywhere else. So in agriculture, children can work as young as 12 years old with very few protections in place. There's no limits to the amount of hours they can work unless it's during the school day. So on the weekends, evenings, early mornings, during summer breaks or spring breaks or any of those sort of school breaks, there are no restrictions to the number of hours that 12-year-old can work at. And in some cases, even as young as 10, if it's a small farm. This is for children that are employed. For children whose parents own the farms, there are no limits to the age or the hours that they can work at, because there's an understanding that the family's going to look out for the well-being of the kid. We're talking here about employment, children who are unrelated, who are on the payroll, employment. And so those children are also allowed to do dangerous work at the age of 16. And what constitutes as dangerous work, even itself, in that list is a very short list. And there's a lot of things in there that belong there that are not listed in there. But at the age of 16, they can start working using heavy machinery. They can start applying pesticides. They can start doing a number of different very dangerous tasks that are reserved for adults in every other industry. In every other industry, you have to be age of 16 to be able to get that after school job, with restrictions to the number of hours, what hours you can work. So there's two very different realities for farm workers and children across America that work everywhere else. And so what us advocates who have been working on this issue for a while have seen, again, is those negative trends, the health implications, both short-term and long-terms for children, the death rates for children that are working out in agriculture, the impact it has on their education, the fact that many of these kids lose their childhood, and don't end up finishing school and don't end up going on to fulfill the wonderful dreams that they had as young children, of being professionals and having these wonderful careers. It comes with a lot of barriers in place. And so we want to be able to go back to the root cause of this. And many of it has to do with the fact that these kids ended up having to go work in the fields to make ends meet with their families. And so what our belief is the same way as children across America are protected, are made sure that they're doing jobs that are safe for them, their jobs with limits in the number of hours and the types of environments they can be exposed to. Those are the sort of rules we want to see children working in agriculture. They also deserve to be protected. We've seen that it has a negative impact in their future. It keeps them from being able to fulfill their dreams, to be able to break out of the cycle of poverty. And so that's what we want to be able to see. And there are legislative solutions. There has been a bill, the Children's Act for Responsible Employment, introduced by Congresswoman Rhoda Allard, that would look at being able to create parity in the laws so that these child labor law exceptions are pulled out, and so that all children are protected, both in agriculture and outside of agriculture. There are other laws, such as the Children Don't Belong in Tobacco Fields, that would outlaw children. Right now, children cannot go buy tobacco products because we acknowledge as a society that tobacco and nicotine can be very dangerous for these children. Yet they're allowed to be able to go work and harvest tobacco. So it has all of the dangers that all of agricultural work has: the heavy machinery, pesticide exposure, the extreme weather conditions, the long hours of work. But then in addition to that, you also have high levels of nicotine exposure that create illnesses in these kids, that creates addiction in these kids, that creates additional layers of danger for these children, that we just feel that no child belongs out there. Nobody under the age of 18 should be out there harvesting tobacco leaves and being exposed to the equivalent of what could be up to 36 cigarettes and nicotine levels that we're seeing these kids that are being exposed to. We know that that's not a safe place for these children. Our children belong in classrooms. Our children belong in healthy environments. They deserve to have an opportunity to be children. We know that all of those pieces are incredibly important to make sure that they are happy, healthy, fulfilled adults. And we're not going to do that. We're not going to be able to see any of that or help them be that if we don't tackle some of these policies that are hurting our families.
I'm so happy to have you on here, Norma, because you say all of this in so much better words than I could. And there are so many things that we haven't yet touched on. I mean, there's the mental health. Also, there's the immunizations that kids might not be getting right now because they're afraid to go to the doctor. There's the migrating that you did mention, but like, how are they going to go about transferring schools now when things are online? Like, it adds a whole nother layer of complexity that will then discourage kids from enrolling when they're already feeling discouraged. But one thing I did want to make sure we touched on was a question about Migrant Seasonal Head Start. When they open up, are they able to do COVID testing for kids and their parents? Do you know that?
There are many sites that are doing that. There's health clinics across the country, health centers that are doing that. And even some state governments are partnering up with organizations on the ground to be able to provide testing for farm workers. We're still working to be able to help implement that across. I think that if the migrant and seasonal Head Start centers don't have actual testing at their centers, at the very least, they'll have a list of resources of where families can be able to go nearby to be able to find help, not only for COVID testing, but for treatment, but for other resources, whether they're needing help financially or face mask or anything else like that. Those those Head Start centers become very trusted beacons in the community, centers where their families are going to be welcomed, and also provided with connections around the community. They have people dedicated to finding those sort of resources to help the families out. So they should definitely still get in touch with those programs, and they will be directed to the resources and those testing sites for those that feel like they need it.
Great. And just before we go, I want to ask, is there anything from Justice for Migrant Women that you want us to highlight or to mention right now? I know you always, you guys have so many new initiatives, and there was just a really moving tribute to essential workers that took place on Labor Day weekend. Lots of good stuff.
Absolutely. You know, we welcome you guys to go check out all this exciting stuff that you mentioned that we've been keeping ourselves busy with on our website. You can be able to learn more about whether it's resources and information about farm worker women, about some of these bills that I mentioned. You can also find information about the COVID-19. We've been doing fundraising to be able to get these resources to organizations on the ground on the front lines that are helping these families. We've been providing masks for folks. We've been providing donations of products and goods. And we're doing a number of different initiatives to be able to encourage people to be able to go out and vote and check how to, to make sure that they're able to register to vote, and to be able to find their polling places. Our mission is to be able to build strength in our communities, especially with migrant women. We know that there's so much potential in our community. I mean, we're living proof. Myself, our CEO and founder, Monica Ramirez, is a very inspirational, wonderful person that also comes from farm worker community. You know, we work alongside these people. We get our strength from these folks. And so we're very excited to be a voice for them. And so we encourage you to come check out our initiatives and find more ways to be able to support migrant women and their families, because we're going to be stronger together as a society when we support our migrant women that are essential workers that give so much to us, and we thank them all from the bottom of our hearts for being able to provide us with those delicious fruits and vegetables that we get to enjoy every day.
That is for sure. Many thanks to you, Norma, for joining us today. I want to also thank her for starting our art and essay contest several years ago. So we really thank you for that, because it's been really one of my favorite parts of what I do.
Yes, it's
right now.
Every time you get those entries coming in, it's absolutely Christmas, and it reminds every one of us of why it is that we're doing this work.
It really does. All right. Well, thank you so much, Norma. We look forward to talking to you again sometime soon.
Thank you, Kendra. Sounds good. Bye, everyone.
Bye.